Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Ayin Chet. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Adi Wenner, who's drafting into Tzahal today. Adi, we are so proud of you. We pray that your Amunah and Hashem will guide you to make the right moral and ethical choices throughout your service to Medina Israel. We hope you have a meaningful service. May you continue to go Michael Achayel. We love you, Ima, Abba, and all your siblings. We're going to get started now with the line in the Mishnah that says, Afilu hu ima b'mitah. I hope I translated this right yesterday, but we're talking about that the get is with her in her bed, in her husband's house. So even if it's with her in bed, that doesn't work. So now, Amarava lo shanu ela b'mitah shelo. This is only if it's his bed. Aval b'mitah shelav, she's in her own bed, migureshet. In other words, if it's her bed in his house, then she's divorced because that's kind of thought of as her space. Tanya Namihachi brought to support this. Rabbi Eliezer Omer b'mitah shelo ena migureshet, b'mitah shela migureshet. Okay, this is exactly what we just said. Rabbi Eliezer says if it's his bed, it doesn't work. It's her bed, it actually does work. U'b'mitah shela migureshet. Is she really divorced in her own bed? Isn't this kilyosha lokach bereshut mochehu? Isn't this just like the case where you're in, let's say, somebody's house? You bring your own utensils, you fill it up with something that you're purchasing from them, but you're still in their house. And there's actually a debate among the Moraim about whether this works or not. So if you say that in her own bed in his house it works, this would be an example, Shmat Minad, this would be the exact same example. And you would infer from here, Kilyosha lokach b'reshut mochel kana lokach. That if you use your kelim, fill them up in the domain of the seller, then it would seem like it would work. So the Gemara explains it must be the mitah is a little bit different here. It's not just like a utensil of hers in his house. That wouldn't necessarily work. But lo tzricha digavoa asara. It means that the bed is 10 tefachim off the ground and it's hers. That creates its own domain once it's 10 tefachim high. So then they say, V'hayika makom kare. But wait, even though it's 10 tefachim high, it makes its own domain. The legs, the four legs of the bed are on the ground and the ground is his. So it really is still in his domain, to which they say, Amakom kari lo kapid inashe. And this kapid we're going to get to a few times today, which is, he doesn't really care. That's not space that's so valuable. Those little 4 squares of space that the bed is resting on isn't really considered to be making the bed in his domain. It really is 10 tefachim high, therefore her own domain. It's kind of considered in her possession, meaning it's hers, and it creates its own domain. And therefore, we're going to say that she can accept the get if the get is on her bed. That is considered she's accepting the get. That is, if again he throws the get onto the bed. Then we said if it's on her lap or on her in her basket, she's divorced. Amai, isn't this the same thing? Again, it's like a buyer's utensils in the domain of the seller, and that shouldn't work. So we're going to have a few explanations here. One is the kalta, and they don't necessarily disagree with each other, these opinions. It's just we're providing different options here. So they say it's that the kalta is hanging on her. It's hanging onto her body, which means it's attached to her. But they say the same thing that Shmuel said. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, another possibility, he says as long as it's tied to her, even if it's not hanging. This would mean it's on a long string and it's dragging on the floor. It's not hanging, but it is attached to her. So both say it has to be attached, it's just kind of in a different manner. The talta is not attached to her, but it's between her legs. From Sharshia, Bar Dimi Amal, who he sells baskets, in which case he has tons of baskets in his house and he wants them around because he wants people to see all sorts of baskets, even if, let's say, it's hers and it's not for sale, but it makes his store look good that he has a lot of things. It reminds me of a good story that someone told me recently, a little while ago. Maybe I even mentioned this in class once. It was such a great story that he started off, his father had passed away, and he was telling us how his father started out very young without a lot of money, and he had a shoe store. And what he would do is he would sell, he had no shoes to really sell. So we got a few shoes but then he filled his store with shoeboxes, empty shoeboxes, to make it look like he had a lot of shoes. But this is the same kind of thing. The guy's happy to have lots of baskets. It looks good in your store when you look like you have a lot of things, even if they're not necessarily yours, in which case he's happy to let her use the space, because it's not really his space. It's true, it's his space, but it's the space he's using for all these baskets. And therefore it's really hers, just in his space. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Makom Cheka Kanoila, and this has to go again with what we saw about before, Kapid. He doesn't care. It doesn't bother him that space is being used, which means it's really, he's kind of like giving her the space. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Makom Cheka Kanoila, Makom Kalta Kanoila. Again, he allows her to have a space. When you allow someone into your house, so they take up space, right? But you're allowing them to have that space. So he lets her have the space for her lap, which is where the kalta, right, we saw before, if the get is in her lap, or he also provides her the space for her basket. Amarava, okay, and that was the last explanation. So we have a bunch, either hanging on her, tied to her, between her legs, which he doesn't really, again, he allows her to use the space in between her legs, or he sold baskets and therefore was happy to have his house filled with baskets, or this makom kalta, he allows her to have the space for her basket in general. So what's the reason? And here we get again to the kapde, makpid. Is he cares about this or not? Okay, the reason is people just don't, right? He doesn't care. He's allowing her to have that space for her use. Tanya Namihachi is a bright to support Rabbi Yochanan, Zarkula letoch hekal letoch kalta, or letoch kol davar shu kekalta, harezo meguresh. Her lap, her basket, or anything that's like her basket. Now, kol davar shu kekalta latuye. What is this including? What's like the kalta? Latuye taska de ka'achla batam. It's also like a bag that she has her dates in. Okay, so something like that. Also, he lets her have space to put that down in his house. New mission. Amarla can see shtar chovze. If he says, take this promissory note, and it's actually a get. We saw this on Daf Nun Hey. How this works in, there's actually a bit of a debate there, but we'll talk about that soon. Or she finds it behind him. She looks at it and she sees it's her get. Eino get ad sheomarla hagite. Unless he says, this is your get, it doesn't count as a get. Okay? So now, Natam biyada b'hi yeshena, he puts it in her hands and she's sleeping. Ne'ora, and she wakes up. Kor'a v'harei gita, and she sees, oh look, there's a get right here, it's mine. But he gave it to her while she was asleep. Eino get ad sheomar la hagite. He has to say, this is your get. It sounds like he doesn't have to give it to her again, okay? But as long as he just has to say, and we're going to see a dissenting opinion in the Gemara, but he just has to say, this is your get. And even though he gave it to her before without a proper giving of it, as long as he says, this is your get, that's a good get. Okay. Just one second. I wanted to look at this Tosfot for a minute. Right. So Tosfot says exactly the case that we saw in Hanizak, in Miu Kashe, in the middle of Tosfot, Eno get out Yomar la Hagiteh. It's difficult. Even if he didn't say it, it would be good. Right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgeda, Nishma. Amar la'edim ru'u getze. Right? And basically he says to the Eidim, look at this get, this is a get, right? But then he gives it to the woman and he says, this is your promissory note. So Yesh Lomar, so how do you reconcile that with here? Where there he was able to basically say, he pretended that it was a shtar chov because he was embarrassed to basically give her the get. And then turns out, right, that she ends up, she doesn't realize it's her get when she gets it. So what's the difference there? So why there does it work and here it doesn't work unless he says this is your get? So they say because it would have to be that later they tell her you're divorced. Okay? Even though, again, it's a much stronger question than the answer here. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. So there's a bit of a question how this is reconciled with that sugya. Moving on. Now we get to the Gemara. I don't understand why this works, the Gemara said. This is kind of like when he says this is your get, where he kind of gave it to her when there was no real giving of it because she was sleeping. So it's kind of like saying take your get off the floor. But Amarava, and we already learned this, Rava says, This doesn't work. So it must be that there must be some kind of taking of it. It must be she takes it from behind him, to which they say, she takes it from him. That doesn't mean that's not a nitina. He has to give it to her. So he made her like a little, he kind of moved his hip a little, to move toward her so that she could take it, in which case he's considered giving it to her in that way. So if he says, right, take this shtarchov, this promissory note, or she took it from behind his back, and she read it, and it turns out it's her get. Eino get ad shiomar la hagitech, divrei Rebbe. So it's not a get unless he says hagitech. That's Rebbe. That matches our Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer laolam eino get ad shitlena himena v'yachzor v'yitznen alav v'yomar la hagitech. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says this isn't a get until if he gave it to her in a bad kind of way, where he didn't say this is your get, it wasn't clear. He has to re-give her the get and then say hagitech. So he has to get the get back from her, give it to her again. Basically, it was totally useless what he did. Adding the words hagitech at the end doesn't really help. Nitano biado, continuing on in this braita, v'hi yeshena, if he puts it in her hands, similarly if she's sleeping, ne'ora v'kor'a v'harei gita, she wakes up, she reads it, and it's her get. Eino get at shomar la hagitech divrei Rebbe. Again, Rebbe says, not a get until he says the words, this is your get. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, ad shitlena himenu. He has to take it back from her, give it back to her. Yomar la hagitech. Okay, so here's another braita that basically shows the same idea with the same machlokes. So now they say, utzricha, why did you need both? Di'i itmar, and why did you need both these cases of sleeping and, right, he gives it to her and claims it was a promissory note. If you had it only in the first case, you would say, well, then Rebbe said it because she was meant to be divorced. In other words, she was able to be divorced at that moment. When he gave her the promissory note, she was awake and aware. So theoretically, he gave her a get, and he could have given her a get and divorced her. So therefore, just by saying hagitech, it works. But she's sleeping. You can't actually divorce someone when they're sleeping. Maybe he agrees with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that he has to give it to her a second time. That's why you needed both. And now the reverse. If you just had the second one, you would say Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. You would have said that's what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says you have to give it to her again because she was asleep. But maybe in the first case, they would be fine because he gave it to her while she was awake. And that's why you need both. Amar Rava, katav la get unitano biyad avda yashen umishamarto hareze get. Rava says, if he wrote her a get and gave it to his servant who was sleeping, his slave who was sleeping, her slave who was sleeping, well, her slave is going to be like her courtyard. Okay, so we had a whole thing about this. We'll get back to that again. Can a slave be a courtyard or not? But if he was sleeping and she was watching him when he was sleeping, meaning he was under her charge when he was asleep, hareze get, right? It's her slave and he's under her charge. So by just giving it to the sleeping slave doesn't need to be awake because it's like a chatzer. Chatzer isn't awake. This counts. Ne'ol, but if he's awake, ain't no get. This is interesting, right? It's definitely the opposite of her. If she's sleeping, it's not a get. If she's awake, it is a get. But with he's sleeping, it's good. If he's awake, it's a problem. Why? If it's awake, it's a problem. He is like a watch courtyard, but who's watching over him? Himself. Once he's awake, the woman's not watching over him anymore. He's his own human being. So while he's sleeping, he's kind of an inanimate object. But when he's awake, he's an animate object, and he moves and he talks and he has his own mind, and therefore he's not considered owned by her. And he is owned by her, but not for the purposes of being like a courtyard. To which the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Yashenu misharto hareze get. How could that be a get? We already learned this. It's a moving courtyard. And even if you say and a moving courtyard doesn't acquire, she can't use it to get her get. Shani might say, well, he's not moving, he's sleeping. But Rava said, if you were walking, you wouldn't be kone. Then when you're sitting, you also can't be kone. Even if you're not moving, you can't be kone. So even though he's sleeping, it shouldn't work because potentially he could have been moving. To which they answer, v'hilchata b'kafut. They say the halacha is that it actually works if he's tied. Okay, if he's tied up, right, then you could actually, so if he's tied up and sleeping, it would work. Again, hard to follow that you would be really tying somebody up. You'd have this slave that was tied up. But again, they're talking in a theoretical manner. Like, how could we theoretically have a case where an eved could get your get if he was bound and basically not movable, not moving at all, not able to move? New Mishnah. Okay, let's maybe review our daf until this point. So we started with, if she's in the bed with the get, it works, right? And then we said, only if it's her bed, and how could that work? Because, right, he basically, we would say it's 10 tefachim high, and then it doesn't teach us anything about you having something in your vessel in someone else's, in the seller's house, right? Which there's a machloket about, but this is different because it's its own domain. Then we said the same thing though. What about in her own chek, in her own kalta, in her own basket? That seems to also indicate, to which again, they say all these cases, it would have to be, it's attached to her. It's somehow he gave her the space for it, something along those lines. Then we got to this new Mishnah about her getting the get in a kind of, let's say, bad manner where it's not clear it's a get or she's sleeping. It's not actually a get until he either says, this is your get, according to Rebbe. According to Rashbad, he actually has to say, he has to take the get back, give it a second time, and say, this is your get. Okay, we said contradiction somewhat from the case of Hanizakin, right? Question how exactly to resolve that. And then we saw, why did you need both cases of when he said it was a promissory note and not a get, and the case of sleeping. Okay, and we distinguished what the difference is between the cases. Okay, then we had this last question about how could, if we give it to an eved who's sleeping, it actually works, but if the eved is up, it doesn't work, but even the eved who's sleeping has to have his feet bound, so he actually can't move. Okay, new Mishnah. In other words, again, for it to be effective, not that you should do it this way. New Mishnah. Okay, now what happens? They're in the public domain. He throws the get toward her. Karov la, if it's close to her, megureshet. Karov, then she's divorced. If it's karov lo, if it's close to him, ain't a megureshet. She's not divorced. So this is a big debate we're going to see in the Gemara. What do we mean by close to? Close to in what sense? What exactly are we talking about? We don't really understand. Mechza, it's 50-50 or in the middle there. Megureshet ain't a megureshet. We're not sure. V'chein linyan kiddushin, it's the same thing for betrothal. If he throws the money at her or throws a shtar kiddushin at her, it depends who it's closer to. V'chein linyan chov, same thing if you return chov. I owe you money and I throw it at you. And then in between the time I throw it at you and you go to pick it up, it gets lost. It falls into the gutter and is gone. Something happens to it. Who's responsible, me or you? So it all depends on where it fell. Again, right? If it's Amarlo Bal Chovo Zrokli, okay, now it would have to be where you said, throw me chovi, what you owe me, Uzrakolo, and I threw it, and I didn't have the best aim, I guess. Karov Lamalve, if it's close to you, Zachaha Malve, you already gain it, and if something happens to it, it's your tough luck. Karov Lalove, if it's closer to me, Halove Chayav, then I have to replace the money. Mechza al Mechza, Shneim Yachloku. If it's 50-50, then we split. So now the Gemara is going to ask the basic question. Hechidami karov la, the hechidami karov lo. What do we mean by near? So Amarav, arba amot shala zeu karov la, arba amot shalo zeu karov la. So if it's, now, right now, we don't understand Rav exactly, but we're going to have three different explanations of Rav. But Rav is basically saying, when it means near, it means your 4 cubits. People's space, right? This goes back to Masechet Shabbat and Eruvin. And lots of other sugyot that we found around. 4 cubits of space around you is considered your personal space, even in the public domain. So Rav says it's all about his 4 cubits or her 4 cubits. So now we have to figure out, we understand if it got within her 4 cubits, it's hers, because that's all her domain. It's like her chatzir, basically. If it's, or even her yad, right? Your 4 cubits are yours. If it's in his, then it's within his 4 cubits still he threw, but it didn't go very far. then it's his, meaning it's not a get. What's mechza al mechza though? How do you have in between my 4 cubits and your 4 cubits? What exactly is the case? So we're going to have 3 different explanations. Their 4 amot overlapped. His 4 cubits and her 4 cubits, they were very close to each other, and he throws it. Why he didn't just hand it to her if he was right there, you have to ask, but let's just assume he threw it. So now so then they say, right, basically my 4 cubits overlap. Your 4 cubits, it's not, right? We don't know whose it is. So why don't we just see who got into that space first? Whoever got there, acquire the 4 cubits. Let's say I got there first, and then my husband came, but it was already my space. So he came in, but I've acquired the space already. So if it's within my 4 cubits, that there also is 4 cubits, it's mine. If you say they both came at the exact same time, we can't be exacting in our time. Must be one of them got there a second before the other, in which case, right, there's no such thing really as things happening where it's very unlikely they happen the exact same millisecond. So therefore, one of us must have gotten there first, in which case that should determine. There shouldn't be a suffix case. Ela Amarav Kahana, so second explanation, because I don't really like that explanation. Bishmona Amot B'tzum Samoriskin. It's where your 4 cubits and my 4 cubits are right, they border on each other. So they don't overlap. So it's not a matter of who got there first. And the get, okay, turning out I'm a bet. Get Yotze Mitachat get Yotze Me'arba Amot Shelo LaArba Amot Shela. The get is overlapping partly in his and partly in hers. So that's a good example of suffix. But what do you mean? Why wouldn't you say the get is really in his reshut partially, which means it never really left his domain since it started in his domain, right? It needs, Rashi even says, Ana Natan biyadabina. We need him to pass it from his domain to hers. And if it's still, it has to be completely hers, and this is still partially in his, so it definitely shouldn't work. So again, why is it a case of doubt? So therefore, they bring a third explanation. Ella, and this is all a third explanation within Rav, who said the whole thing is this 4 cubit issue. Rabbi for Rav Yosef, oh, it's not a suffix where we're not sure. We know where it fell, but we don't know who's to put it in. Is it right? It's in between or it's overlapping. But we have 2 groups of witnesses who witnessed the giving of the get. So there was a debate about whether it got into his 4 cubits or her 4 cubits. Okay, whether it was still in his 4 cubits or whether it got into her 4 cubits. And that's the suffix. It's a suffix about what exactly happened. It's not that the situation is in between. It's that we just don't know what the situation was. And that's kind of a better example that works to explain it according to Rav. But here comes Rabbi Yochanan. So again, that was all within Rav, who says it's the 4 cubits. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Karov la shaninu, afilu mea ama, v'karov lo shaninu, afilu mea ama. This is all relative. Distance. Is it closer to him or closer to her? They could be 100 meters from each other, 100 cubits from each other, 200 cubits from each other. It's all a matter of when he threw it to her, was it closer to him or closer to her? Now, right now, it seems like we're talking about proximity, but soon we're going to define this a little bit differently. So what's a case of we're not sure? Amar Rav Shimon bar Abba, L'didi mefarshei leminei Rabbi Yochanan. They explained to me, right? Rabbi Yochanan himself explained this to me. Hu yachol l'shomra v'hi eina yachol l'shomro. Zeu karov lo. What does karov mean? It means he has a way to protect it. Okay, maybe he has a drone hovering over watching it. You know, who knows? But right, obviously not in those days. But if he can protect it and she can't, that means it's karov lo. If they both have, sorry, I skipped a line. If she can protect it and he can't, zeu karov la. But shneim yecholim l'shamro, both of them can protect it, and it's in an area that they both have the ability to make sure nothing happens to it. Or shnehem ein yecholim. Now, the way the commentaries explain this is neither can without the help of the other. In other words, it has to be obviously that someone can protect it. Otherwise, it's nothing. But if they can protect it only with the help of the other, and neither can protect it on their own, then zeu mechza al mechza. That's a case of 50-50. Now, why is Rabbi Yochanan going so far as to say, if you throw it, and it's somewhere in between the two of them, we could say as long as it's closer to her, it works. Many people explain Rabbi Yochanan is saying that this is to prevent aguna situations again. In other words, he's throwing the get to her. Who knows if he'll give her a get another time? He's probably so annoyed. Why else is he throwing the get and not even going to her because he doesn't want to have anything to do with her? And we're worried that he may not actually give her the get. So Rabbi Yochanan goes so far as to say it doesn't even have to reach within her 4 cubits, even if it's thrown and it's closer to her than it is to him, and which really means she has to have some ability to protect it, watch it on her own, then it's hers. Okay? Now, Amaru Rabbanan Kamei Rabbi Yochanan Mishmei Rabbi Yonatan Hachi. So the rabbis brought the Torah of Rabbi Yonatan, who in a second we're going to see is from Babylonia, and they brought his explanation of the Mishnah that matched Rabbi Yochanan's. And they told this to Rabbi Yochanan, Amal, and he said, wow, Yadin Chaver Babla Lepirusha Ki Aitama? Did the Babylonian rabbis know how to explain it just like I did? He was very impressed with them. Tanya Nami Hachi, here's a brighter to support Rabbi Yochanan's reading. Rabbi Eliezer Omel Koshu Karov La Milo Uba Kelev Unitalo. Okay, this is going to prove it all has to do with can he protect it or could she protect it? If it's closer to her than it is to him, and the Kelev comes and grabs it and takes it away, a dog comes, she's not divorced because she can't protect it from the dog. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. If he throws her the get, and we say the get is hers, and then a dog comes and eats it, what, it's not a get? She has to constantly be watching this get, protecting it forever? And lalav hachi kamar. No, this is what he meant to say. The bright. Kol shekarov la milo. What does it mean to be closer to her than to him? And ilu ba kelevun talo hu yachol l'shamro v'hi eina yachola l'shamro ena megureshet. If a dog were to come, even though it's closer to her, if a dog were to come and take it, and she can't stop the dog, but he can stop the dog, then she's not divorced, because that's really considered closer to him, even though physically it might be closer to her. That doesn't matter. Because again, this is proving the way we understood Rabbi Yochanan, the whole issue is, can she protect it or not? Amarle Rav Shmuel, the Rav Yehuda. Now comes explanation number 3. So again, explanation number 1 was karov lo karov la, is within the 4 amot of him or her. Right? And then we had 3 different explanations of what the Metzal Mechza case is. Within that was Rav. Rabbi Yochanan said it means she can protect it on her own without needing his help, okay, versus the space that he can protect on his own without needing her help, but she can't protect it. That's going to be the determining factor. Comes Shmuel to Rabbi Yehuda and says, Shinana, you very smart child, and come listen to me. She has to be able to bend down and reach it. Some people say this is even if it's within her 4 cubits, she might not be able to reach it, and then it's not a good get. Say, how could you say it's within a 4 amot? Isn't her? Some people say we're talking about the center of Rishut HaRabim, where nobody really gets 4 amot because there's tons of people there and nobody even has that 4 amot of space, right? You can imagine you're in the shuk, there's, you're rubbing up against people. You certainly can't say that these 4 cubits are mine. So then you would have to be able to bow down. Ve'at lo tavid uvda ad demata gita liyad. He says, but you are not to do something like this unless she gets the get in hand. Sounds like he's going so far as to say he actually physically needs to put it in her hand, which we've seen you don't really have to do that, but it could be, right? It's unclear exactly how far he takes this, that you really have to be able to do it. Rashi says, Gzera shema yomru al rachok shu karov. Because we're worried that if we allow some space where she can lean down and reach it, we might allow some space which is even closer to him than closer to her, and therefore he doesn't really allow for this. Okay? So he has a very not lenient position, whereas Rabbi Yochanan was very lenient. He has the opposite approach. Amalei Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi. Hava uvda hachi ve'etzruchuach chalitza. There was a case where this happened, and the husband died, and they had no children, and they didn't consider this a get, and they made her do chalitza because of this kind of situation of what Rav Yehuda said, that we have to be extra careful here. V'chein le'inyan kiddushin. Same thing for kiddushin. So Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. L'gitin amru v'lo l'davar acher. Well, now we have a bit of a problem. Rabbi Asi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, they said this for get, but not anywhere else that you have this. Now we're going to have 2 problems. Number 1, we just said v'chein le'inyan kiddushin, it says. And also it said in the Mishnah, kiddushin, yes. And it also said in the Mishnah, chov is the same thing. So, Eitivei Rabbi Abba le Rabbi Asi, first he brings this as a question, v'chein le'inyan kiddushin. To which they answer, when it says Gittin, it meant also Kiddushin. It says this is when they talk about remarrying a divorcee. So it says, and she leaves and she goes and marries someone else. You see, goes, right, leaves the marriage and goes into a marriage. So there you see, Kiddushin and Gerushin are one and the same. But ATV still questions, like I said. It says also when it comes to money, returning a loan. That's certainly not like Gerushin, like divorce. Well, they say Zrok li chovi uzrakolo karov lamav zakha love karov lelove love chayav mechzal mechzal shem yachloku. This is the Mishnah. It says exactly same thing as get. So how do we explain that? According to this statement that that Rabbi Yochanan said, or Rabbi Asi said, that Rabbi Yochanan said. What's the case in our Mishnah? It's not exactly a regular case of throw me the loan, but throw me the money you owe me. But if I said, throw me the money, or you said the case before was you were the one who owed the money, you say to me, throw the money and you will be exempt. Then I'm exempt as long as it got closer to him than it is to me. So that would be an explanation, to which the Gemara said, that's obvious. If I said, you said, throw me the money and you'll be exempt, obviously I'll be exempt if the money gets close to you. That's pretty clear. Well, so now change it a little bit. If you say, throw me the money like a divorce works, okay, like a divorce. Now, what does it mean like a divorce? So we're going to say, it means that the rules of divorce will kick in, even though normally they don't kick in for loans. But in terms of responsibility, it all depends on, right, when you throw it to me, if it's closer to me, then, and something happens to it, I'll be responsible. If it's closer, right, that's what you say. It's closer to me, which is me, but, the borrower, then I'm responsible. And if it's 50-50, right, in the middle somewhere, then we'll have to split it. So now, again, akati ma'lamemra. Okay, if you said it explicitly, it's going to be like get, then why does the Mishnah need to tell us this case? Ma'u detema, you might have thought, you might say, I didn't really mean what I said. What I meant was, give me the money and I'll be divorced from you. I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. I want my money and I want to move on. And you didn't mean I want it to be thrown to me the way a get would be thrown. Well, kamashmalan, that's why the Mishnah tells you, no, if you said it like that, we're going to assume that's what you meant. And therefore, we're going to go by the rules of get, even though normally when it comes to an obligation, a promissory note, we wouldn't say the same thing by get. Amarav Chisda, get biyada u'mishicha biyado. We learned already many times there has to be a get hakoret beino lebeina. Get kritut has to split between them entirely. That means, so if his get is in her hand, but he has a string attached and he can pull it toward him anytime he wants, that's not giving her the get, because he could just pull it away and say, oh no, I didn't really mean it. So she's not divorced. Well, it depends though. If he can pull it and bring it back to him, in a meguresha. But im lav, if it's a very weak string and as soon as he pulls it, it will tear, well then meguresha. Then she's divorced. My time, and what's the reason? Be'inan kritu. You need a clear split, and this is not because he's holding on to something. Amar Rav Yehuda, hayta yada asuya ketapras uzrakola. Her hand is angled down. Okay, normally when you want to catch something, right? Imagine a game of catch. You hold your hands out to catch something. If your hand is angled downward, everything's going to roll right off your hand and it's not going to be caught by you. So Rav Yehuda comes and says if her hand was angled down, uzrakola, and he throws it to her, even though the get reaches her hands, it's going to reach her hands for a second, fall right down on the ground, she's not divorced. To which the Gemara asks a pretty good question based on what we learned today. That get, when it falls out of her hand, is going to fall right on the floor. It's going to be within her 4 cubits. It should be hers, not because it was in her hand, but because it was within her 4 cubits. Well, b'delona. There must be a case where it never fell. It never rested on the ground. What happened? Caught on fire before it fell on the ground. It fell into water and everything disintegrated. It blew away. A number of things could have happened. Again, a little unrealistic, but it's possible. So it would have to be that the get is no longer there. To which the Gemara asks, but another thing, what about the fact that it was in the airspace before it fell on the ground, before it fell and burnt, or before whatever happened to it happened? it was in the airspace of my 4 cubits. As soon as it got on my hand, right, it was in the airspace of my 4 cubits as it was going down. And therefore, and you see that that doesn't really count. So from there, maybe we can get an answer to the question about the airspace of 4 cubits. Tivsho to buy Rabbi Elazar. Why don't we get an answer then to the question that Rabbi Elazar asked? Arba amot she'omru yesh lahem avir or ein lahem avir. The 4 cubits, when we talk about 4 cubits of a person, do we talk about airspace of 4 cubits or ground space of 4 cubits? So this would show us the airspace doesn't count. To which the Gemara says, right? So tifsho ein lahem avir. Sounds like we don't count air. Well, they say no, because it could be hacha b'ma'askina ba'omedet agav nahal to make kara li'ibud. You could say this is a case where we're standing by a river, and the second it falls out of my hand, it's not, even though it goes through the airspace of my 4 cubits, airspace only works if it could theoretically fall on the ground, even if it didn't fall on the ground. But if we know it's about to go into the river and it's going to be lost forever, then it doesn't count as coming into my domain when it goes into my 4 cubits, because there is no airspace for it to, there is no ground space for it to rest on, in which case the airspace is not meaningful at all. But it doesn't necessarily answer our question about airspace in a case where there is ground underneath. Okay, so we're left with that as a, we don't really know what, right? So what they basically say here again is she's not divorced if it goes on her hand and then disappears, but it doesn't really tell us about airspace, because it could be talking about a case where there was a river underneath her and that's why it disappeared, but it wouldn't really tell you about airspace if there was ground. Okay, so what we did in this part of the daf was we talked about him throwing a get. We said safek karov lo, safek karov la, right? What it's megureshet ve'eino megureshet, or near him, his, near her, hers, right? Again, his means she's not divorced. Hers means she is divorced. And then we had 3 different explanations about what it means. Is it 4 cubits? And then within that, we have 3 explanations of what the case of in the middle is and what the case really of karov lo and karov la is. Then we had the second explanation of it's not 4 cubits. It's just who can protect it, even if, right, it could be closer to you or closer to me, but not within our 4 cubits at all. But as long as I have a way to protect that area by myself, then it's considered closer to me. And the third explanation was that she has to lean down and actually pick it up. That was the most limited explanation. Right? Rabbi Yochanan was the most far-reaching, but he tried to, again, resolve aguna issues by allowing this get to be a get. And then we saw, what about the Nyan Kiddushin? And Chov, doesn't it say it's only get, which we said get means getting Kiddushin because they're one and the same. And a Chov where somebody said, return it to me like get. And then we had, what's the Chiddush then? Why are you telling us this? And then we explained that. And then we ended up with this case of the get with a string in the hand. And if he's still attached, right? It's like we say no strings attached, right? It has to be no strings attached, no connection to her whatsoever. And then we have this idea about if her hand is open and on an angle down and she can't catch the get, then it's not a get. Okay, but then the question is, why not land it in her 4 cubits? Well, if it lands in her 4 cubits, yes. If something happens to it on the way down, then no, it was never really considered in her hands. And with that, we'll finish today's daf, wishing everybody a great day.